Hello everyone, welcome to the 23rd lecture of NPTEL course on scalable data science. Today I am Professor Saurangshu Bhattacharya from Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Kharagpur, and today we are going to discuss about clustering. Okay. So, in this lecture we are going to discuss about k-means clustering and its application. So, we are going to talk about the general problem of clustering, and then we are going to talk about the k-means clustering, and then we are going to discuss the Lloyd's algorithm, which is also sometimes called the k-means algorithm or k-means clustering algorithm, which is also same as the EM algorithm. We will also discuss a little bit, not much, and then we will discuss what are the limitations of this Lloyd's algorithm, and then we will discuss recent work which is the so it is a 2007 work which is the k-means plus plus, which takes care of some of the limitations of the Lloyd's algorithm. And then finally, we will see an algorithm which is called the scalable k-means plus plus, which takes care of the some of the limitations of k-means plus plus, which is to say that it makes them more scalable. Okay. So, as we know, clustering is basically an instance of unsupervised learning problem. So, that is when your data does not have labels. Okay. So, it can be used for detecting patterns like in image. So, for example, in this particular representation, you can see that So, in this representation, clustering is being used to segment the images. That is, the image has various portions like the water body, the road or the sand, and then it has the grass and it has sky. So, and it also has clouds. So, we are using a clustering algorithm to segment out these portions of the image. Other pattern detection could, for example, include problems regarding shopping results, so you could try to segment the customers into different groups, and also maybe anomalies, like you could try to say to group the different types of fault patterns in a particular transaction or in a particular machine using clustering, and then from that you can try to derive some insight. So, it can be also used for optimizing. For example, you could it can be used for distributing data across machines. It could be used for cleaning up search results. It could be used for facility location for city planning. So, in general, it can be used for removing outliers and abnormal data points. Okay. So, and more generally, unsupervised learning is very useful for exploratory data analysis, which is to say that you initially do not know what to do, and then you are doing some data analysis. So, for example, in this figure you can see that so this is some gene microarray data which has been clustered using dendrogram, and then you can see it finds groups of similar clusters. So, this is one group, this is another group, and so on and so forth, and maybe one can create a phylogenetic tree out of such clustering. Okay. So, what is the basic idea? The basic idea is that you have to group the objects that you want to cluster into a small number of basic groups. Okay. So, the main aspects here are what are the groups. So, for example, how do you define similarity and distance between objects. So, this is the first important thing. So, for example, so this is basically this figure illustrates the fundamental limitation of a clustering. So, you could try to cluster it using the first clustering, which is this, or you could try to cluster it using the second clustering, which is this, and it is not clear which of them is the best. So, this is the basic problem of unsupervised learning, that it is an ill-posed problem. Okay. So, in order to make it concrete, we have to define certain things. So, first of all, we have to define a similarity measure or a distance between objects, and then which will basically define what you mean by meaningful similarity, and then you may have to tell how many groups and so on and so forth. Okay. So, essentially, so the first thing is to develop an object representation. Okay. So, how do you develop an object representation? So, you can either depending on the situation, you can represent the objects using vectors, which is the most common case and which is also the case we will be looking at. But you could also represent the object using a set, that is one way. For example, in case of images, maybe you want to look at the objects as sets, or you may want to look at the objects as sequences, which is the case when, let us say, you are trying to cluster strings or something like that, or DNA sequences, for example. Yeah. And the second thing that you have to decide is the interaction representation. Okay. So, so basically you could either take all pairs of interactions, which is the case in many cases, or you could take the interactions on a network, which is sometimes called clustering on network, and so on and so forth. So, okay. Now, once you have defined these two, so once you have defined the object and the interaction, then you need to come up with the distance function, which is probably the most important thing. So, the distance function could, for example, be the LP norm between vectors, or Jaccard distance for sets, or edit distance for sequences, and or divergences for probability distribution. So, these are all standard distance functions. So, for this lecture we will mostly be dealing with vectors, and we will look at LP, or rather more precisely L2 distance, which is also called the Euclidean distance. Okay. But all the other measures are possible. Okay. So, typically distances will have these three properties: metric property, that is the distance should be positive, okay, it should be symmetric, and it should obey what is called the triangle inequality, which is that the distance between x and z will always have to be distance smaller than the sum of the distance between x and y, which is the third point, and y and z. Okay. So, these are some of the properties under which our analysis, we will define our algorithms and we will analyze them. The second interesting or important property is that we should be able to calculate an average of the data points, for example, which minimizes. So, for example, you could, if you have data points p I, okay, you could try to calculate the average. So, this is the average, or sometimes also called centroid, okay, of these data points p I, okay, such that the x which minimizes the distance or the sum over the distance from all such data points p I to x. Okay. So, in other words, if you have lot of such points, maybe your x should be somewhere here, okay, which minimizes all these pairwise distances or sum of all these pairwise distances. Okay. So, we should have a representation of x. Okay. So, this is another property which we will need. Okay. So, these are some of the formulas for the distances. Most importantly, we will be using the L2 distance, which is the Euclidean distance, and so one can also use L1 distance and L infinity distance, and we can easily calculate the averages. So, for example, in this case it is just the centroid. So, your basically x is going to be just 1 by the number of points, and then sum over I is equal to 1 to n p I. So, this is the formula for the centroid. Okay. So, in case of vectors and when the distance is L2 distance, it is very easy to calculate the centroid. Another related distance is the cosine distance. Okay. Now, so one can use so now this objective function can be specified in many ways. So, for example, one way is to specify the number of clusters. Okay. So, if you have k clusters, then you have a well defined objective function which you want to minimize for obtaining a good clustering. We will see how. So, basically the k-means clustering algorithm which we will discuss comes in this category. Other than that, sometimes you want to specify the cluster separation or cluster quality index, okay, something like maybe a threshold on the radius of the cluster, or maybe something like Dunn's index and things like that. Okay. So, this is another way of doing clustering. So, for example, threshold based clustering is one example. Yet other times you may want to specify some graph based measure. Okay. So, these are sometimes called spectral clustering techniques, okay, where you basically define a graph over all the data points, and then you try to minimize a graph based metric over this set of data points. And finally, you may not want to specify any metric. For example, in case of hierarchical clustering, you just try to create hierarchies and try to create clustering at different levels, which is also called the dendrogram. So, arguably the first one is the most widely used clustering technique, and in this lecture we will be discussing the first one, which is the k-means clustering. Okay. So, what is k-means clustering? So, k-means so as we have already discussed, so basically the distance function in case of k-means clustering is typically L2 distance, which we have already designed and described, which is also the Euclidean distance. And now, we also specify a value of k, which is the number of cluster. Now, once we have specified all this, we need to find a set of cluster centers C, okay, which is C1 till Ck. So, we need to find k cluster centers, one for each of these clusters, such that so given all the data points x, okay, sum over all the data points, the minimum over Cx, distance from x to Cx whole square is minimized. So, what this minimum over Cx does is it calculates the distance of x from its nearest cluster center. So, it basically calculates the distance of x from its nearest cluster center, okay, and the total such distance should be minimized. Okay. So, this is the k-means clustering formulation. Okay. Yeah. So, and the problem is that you have to find this set C. So, you are not given this cluster center, you are only given the value of k, okay, and you have to find C1 till Ck that needs to the minimization of the above cost, okay, and this leads to a natural partitioning of the data. Okay. So, this algorithm has a large amount of work both from theory and data mining community, and basically it is also used very extensively in practice. Another way of looking at the same problem is that the best k clustering of data can be obtained by minimizing the radius of each cluster. Okay. So, in other words, another way of putting the same thing is, once you specify a cluster center, okay, so once you specify a cluster center, you can find all the points that belong to this cluster. Those are precisely the points which are closer to this cluster center than any other cluster center which is there. Okay. And now, the problem of k-means is, if you try to draw a circle something like this, where all the points belonging to this cluster center will fall within this circle, then the problem of k-means clustering is trying to minimize the radius of this circle. Okay. Again, we have already discussed this, that once you know the clustering, it is very easy to calculate the cluster center, which is given by this formula, and vice versa. So, once you know the cluster center, it is very easy to calculate the clustering, that is, which cluster, which points belong to which cluster. Okay. Okay. So, this minimizing radius can also be thought of as minimizing the variance, which is minimizing this quantity for each cluster center. Okay. So, we will see how this works out. Okay. So, now we describe the Lloyd's algorithm, which is the algorithm for k-means clustering. Okay. So, what is the Lloyd's algorithm? It is an iterative algorithm, it is a very simple algorithm. Okay. It says you initially randomly select the cluster centers. Okay. So, given some set of points, you can randomly select some of the given points as cluster centers, or you could choose randomly any other points as cluster centers. Okay. And then you do these two steps iteratively. Okay. So, you assign each point to, or rather let me put it this way, instead of saying these two steps, you should do these two steps iteratively. Okay. So, once you have the cluster centers, you assign the points to their nearest cluster centers. In other words, you actually calculate the clustering. Okay. So, you calculate which points belong to which clusters, and once you have done this, you recalculate the cluster centers, which is the centroid calculation. Okay. So, you do the centroid calculation again. Okay. And then you keep repeating these steps again and again. So, these recalculating the centers gives you the current centers of the partitions, and then you again repartition using now the current centers. Okay. And so, this is an iterative algorithm. So, when do you stop this iteration? So, one time that you can stop this iteration is when no points change their clusters. Okay. So, every time the points, the clustering remains the same. So, every time the points are assigned to the same cluster. Okay. Or another way of stopping could be that you maintain the cluster centers from the previous cluster, and then you see how much these cluster centers are shifting, and if they do not shift much, then you can stop the algorithm. So, both of these are equivalent. Okay. So, so this is a run through of the algorithm. So, you first initialize randomly. So, in this case we are showing all the data points and we have k is equal to 3. Okay. So, we have k equal to 3. Yes. So, so these are the 3 initialized cluster centers rather. Now, next is for every other point you assign it to the nearest cluster. So, basically this point gets assigned to this cluster, this point gets assigned to this cluster, and all the other points gets assigned to the blue cluster. And now, you recompute the cluster center. So, if you see now, so earlier you had assigned this point to this point. Now, because both of these points are in this cluster, your new cluster center is this green point, which is the centroid of these 2 points. Similarly, your new cluster center for this cluster, the red cluster, is this point, which is the centroid of these 2 points, and then the new cluster center for the blue cluster is this point, which is the centroid of all these 5 points. And then you keep repeating this. So, you keep repeating it, and then it converges to a particular clustering. Okay. So, it converges. So, you can see that as you keep repeating things, it converges to a particular clustering. So, you see up till now this point was belonging to this cluster, but now it gets reassigned to this cluster because it is closer to this cluster center, and then you get the final clustering. Okay. So, the analysis of this algorithm. So, basically suppose you have k centers, n points and d dimensions, then you can see that time taken to compute new cluster assignments is OKND, because d is the time taken to compute the distance between any 2 points, ND is the time taken to compute the distance of all the points from k many cluster centers. So, for each cluster center and each point you have to compute the distance from each cluster center and then assign it to the closest cluster center. And then of course, OND is the time taken to recompute the new centers. And so, the question comes, how many iterations do you need to run? And So we have seen that this is the objective function for k-means clustering. So another point is that you can see that this cost decreases at every step. Okay. This is because so if you see if you consider the so for any point when it gets assigned to its nearest point. Okay. So, the dx comma cx becomes minimum for that point. So, reassignment to the nearest point minimizes this for every point. Okay. And hence after every iteration, and similarly when you recompute the cluster center. Okay. So, for the nearest point so for the nearest point basically for any given cluster the distance of the centroid is, or the centroid is by definition is the point which is at a minimum distance from all the points in that cluster. Hence this sum over distances is also minimized when you recompute the cluster center. So, both steps actually reduce the value of this total objective function, which is the sum total of cost of each cluster. So, one way of thinking about it is the sum total of cost of each cluster. Another way of thinking about it is that it is sum total of cost of each point or the distance of each point to its closest neighbor. Okay. So since the objective function reduces in every iteration, so this algorithm is basically guaranteed to converge. Okay. And there are some analysis which shows that in the worst case it may take exponential number of steps, but typically you do not see so many steps. So, typically you see whenever you run the k-means clustering it converges within a finite number of steps. Okay. So, what is the problem? Okay. So, the problem is this, that the problem is where do the cluster centers lie after it has converged. Okay. So, for example, this here I am showing one example output from a k-means clustering. So, you can see that actually here the two clusters are more well separated and here the two clusters are merged. Okay. But still the final solution here is that there are two cluster centers, green and purple here, and the corresponding clustered points are shown in the color, whereas there is only one blue cluster center here. Okay. So, this kind of solution is possible. Okay. Yeah. So, so this figure actually gives you an idea, a bigger idea of why this kind of solution is possible. So, before going into this figure, let me describe, let me tell you that this Lloyd's algorithm can be thought of as a generalization of the EM algorithm or the expectation maximization algorithm for estimating the mixture of Gaussian's distribution. Okay. So, that also gives a kind of proof that the algorithm will always converge. Okay. But both these, so the EM algorithm is well known to be stuck in a local minima. So, so the expectation maximization algorithm is supposed to maximize the log likelihood, function of this distribution. Okay. And it is known that the EM algorithm gets stuck in a local optimum. Okay. So, let us see how it can get stuck in the local optimum. So, so this is one example that illustrates that. So, suppose you randomly choose, suppose this is your data set and you randomly choose this point as the initial blue cluster center, this point as the initial red cluster center and this point as the initial green cluster center. Okay. So, when you reassign the points, these 2 points will become green. Okay. So, this will be the green cluster, this will be the red cluster and this will be the blue cluster. Okay. Whereas, if you choose this to be the green cluster center, this to be the red cluster center and this to be the blue cluster center, then this will be the green cluster, this will be the red cluster and this will be the blue cluster. Okay. Now, as the iterations progresses, the cluster center will not change because this is in the middle of these two and similarly this is in the middle of these two. So, in both cases the cluster center will not change. Okay. And both are 3 clusterings. Okay. But or both are for k is equal to 3, but you can see that the first clustering has a much more distance between the points that are assigned to cluster than the second clustering. So, here the distances are just this plus this, whereas here the distances are this plus this. Okay. So, and both of them are optimum. Okay. So, depending on the initialization, you can arrive at either of these solutions. Okay. So, basically this is an example of how this solution can come. Now, note that you can actually make this arbitrarily worse. So, it is, one may ask that okay, maybe it is a problem, but it is not too bad, but that is not the case, because you can make these clusters as far apart from each other as you want. Okay. So, you can make these points very far apart in this direction and still the logic that I gave will work. Okay. So, not only is it an local optimum, it is actually arbitrarily worse than the best solution or the global optimum. Okay. So, in order to solve these problems, okay, in 2007 Sergey Vasilevsky and David Arthur, they came up with an algorithm called k-means plus plus. So, the algorithm, okay. So, the line of attack is something like this, that you, so clearly the initialization is the problem in case of k-means clustering. Okay. So, if you are starting with a bad initialization, then there is no way you can get to a good solution. Okay. So, maybe we should focus on the initial center position. Okay. And the classical k-means solution is that pick k points at random. So, what the k-means plus plus proposes, okay, yeah. So, for simplicity we will take Gaussian clusters which are spherical clusters. Okay. But this will work, the logic will actually work for any cluster, as we shall prove. Okay. So, so one may select, for example, like we mentioned, the blue cluster center here and the green cluster center here and a red here and a purple here, and then it would always give suboptimal clustering. Okay. But instead, if we select cluster centers using the farthest algorithm. So, what is the farthest algorithm? That is, you first select one cluster center arbitrarily randomly. Okay. So, let us say this is your first cluster center, then you select the next one as the point which is farthest away from the current cluster center. Okay. And then you select the third point which is farthest away from, or whose sum of distances is farthest away from the first 2 points that you have selected, which is somewhere here. Okay. And finally, you select the fourth point which is farthest away from all the 3 points you have selected. Then you have a good starting selection of cluster centers. So, this actually gives a 2 approximation, which is to say that if phi star is your optimal cost for the k-means clustering, okay, then you can be sure that the cost that you get here phi is less than or equal to twice the phi star. So, you cannot do arbitrarily worse than the optimal clustering. You will always be less than twice the cost of the optimal clustering. But this also has a problem. The problem is this. The problem is, suppose you have an outlier like this, a single data point which is very far away from all other data points. Okay. So, this outlier can cause a problem. So, in this case actually there are only 3 clusters, okay, and suppose you want to select 3 clusters. So, then the outlier, so the points that you select may be something like this, okay, and then your clusters will become something like this. Okay. So, this is not the correct clustering because this is just an outlier point. Okay. So, the idea behind k-means plus plus is that basically all these selection methods of points are somehow using this d of x, that is to say that it is choosing the point x according to its distance from existing centers. So, if it is farther away from existing centers, then it is selected more. Okay. So, now so you can think that instead of selecting, so one can select proportionally to d of x to the power alpha. Now, if alpha is equal to 0, that means d of x to the power alpha is always 1. Okay. That gives us the random initialization or the original Lloyd's algorithm. Okay. If alpha is equal to infinity, okay, then you always select the farthest one. Okay. So, this gives the farthest point algorithm. Okay. So, what k-means plus plus does is it selects the points according to alpha is equal to 2, that is it selects the point according to dx squared. Okay. So, if you select like this, there is a so we will come to the algorithm. So, let us go to the algorithm. Yeah. So, the algorithm is the following, that you first select a point. So, once you have selected a set C, so given a set C, you select a new point x from the distribution d square x comma c by sum over d square x comma c. So, sum over x. Okay. So, that is you select the point which is having the, so here dxc is nothing but sum over all cx in C, distance between x and cx. Okay. So, you basically select or rather sample points from this distribution which selects points which are farthest away from the points you have already selected. Okay. So, this is an example of how the algorithm operates. Okay. So, initially you select this green point, blue point and red point, and then you calculate, you run the k-means iterations and you get cluster like this. So, this gets assigned to this cluster, okay. And this has a theta log k approximation guarantee over the actual k-means plus plus. So, we will stop here, and in the next part of this lecture we will see why k-means plus plus is better than all the existing algorithms, and we will also see why it is not scalable and how to scale k-means plus plus to a large data set. Thank you.